This video essay explores the proposition of one paper aimed at animal welfare in general. But for the purpose of this essay, I'm going to make it the focus of herpetoculture and tie it back to snakes and lizards. Let's begin. In 1963, Nico Tinbergen created a framework referred to as the 4 Whys, because Tinbergen, whilst highlighting the complex and diverse behaviour of animals, also argued that there was 4 questions that could be asked about animal behaviour. Number 1, how it develops ontogeny. Number 2, about how it helps an animal survive and reproduce. Number 3, about how it changes over evolutionary time, phylogeny. Number 4, about the neural, hormonal and other mechanisms underlying the behaviour, the causation. This approach has been widely used in the scientific approach to animal welfare. However, the widespread reliance upon natural behaviour as a way of assessing animal welfare is argued outdated by Dawkins. Natural behaviour is commonly defined as behaviour shown by animals living where their ancestors evolved, or at least in man-made environments that allow them similar freedom of movement. The welfare of animals in zoos, farms, and in our cases, people's homes, is then judged by the extent in which they, too, are able to show this natural behaviour. Being able to perform natural behaviour has also become to some what good welfare even means, an expression of animal essence or telos and the way it evolved to be in its natural environment. But is there a more effective, evidence-based way to improve the lives of animals in herpetoculture? To answer that, we must use Tinbergen's 4 Whys. The idea that most animal behaviour is driven by instinctive urges has now been largely discarded by the scientific community. It was originally based on a once influential model by Konrad Lorenz, in which he argued that animals had motivational energy, a drive associated with each of their behaviours, which built up inside them the longer they had to go without doing the behaviour. When the behaviour was performed, that motivational energy would be discharged, and the animal would no longer want to do the behaviour. If the animal was prevented from doing the behaviour, then that levels of motivational energy would rise up and dam up, until it eventually would spill over and result in inappropriate and damaging behaviour. Damming up was then used by Lorenz and others to say that animals had behavioural needs that needed to be met to ensure good welfare. There is some truth to this. Frustration can accumulate inside a deprived animal, resulting in greatly increased tendency to perform a behaviour when the opportunity arises in some cases. Lorenz's model has now been heavily criticised. Apart from its reliance upon unspecified motivational energy, it simply failed to understand much of real behaviour, leading to most scientists to discard it. However, its influence lives on. The 60-year-old idea gave rise to that animals have instinctive motivational drives to perform all their natural behaviour, and it still lives on and influences the way people see animal behaviour today. How many people have you met that think that snakes are just instinctual, mechanical beings that only rely on instinct alone, and they think they just need food, water and warmth, and then the ability to breed, and you're looking after them perfectly? Each behaviour needs a separate understanding of its causation, its development, and what happens if an animal is unable to perform it. Natural behaviour can even be seen as a sign of poor welfare. Behaviours such as defending against an attack by a predator are entirely natural in the sense they occur in nature, but they do not improve welfare as judged by either physical health or what the animal themselves want. Natural behaviours such as constantly searching for food occur not only when the animal is in good, but when it's in poor welfare, such as constantly searching for a vital nutrient. Much natural behaviour of wild animals can be seen as attempts to ward off the constant threats of adversity in their lives. So therefore, natural behaviour taken on its own is a very unreliable indicator of a welfare state of the animal. Without the additional evidence of what happens if a behaviour does not occur, it's impossible to reach and establish a convincing link to welfare, because natural behaviour on its own lacks the most essential indication of animal welfare, and that is whether performance or non-performance of a behaviour actually matters to the animal. It is then possible to effectively ask the animals what they want. The ability of animals to learn makes them much more flexible than if they truly had the outdated fixed set of behavioural instinctive patterns that most people think of. For example, prey and other food comes in a variety of sizes and shapes, and challenges to eat or subdue and are found in a variety of different places and require a variety of different techniques to eat them. By having an innate liking for a particular scent or texture and combining this with the ability to learn many new behaviours to obtain them, the animal can obtain far more flexibility and adaptability to a changing and unpredictable world than if its feeding behaviour involved always doing the same natural behaviour over and over again. It could exploit new foods never encountered by its ancestors and quickly learn to take advantage of new ways of obtaining nutrition, even though these might be quite unnatural and never seen by any wild ancestor. Far from being fixed and instinctive, most animal behaviour is subtle and constructive interplay between genes and environment. Genes can specify what the animal finds rewarding or punishing, but the genes don't specify what the behaviour has to be in order to achieve these ends. The animal's environment and own experiences shape how to reach rewards or avoid punishments. By discovering what animals find reinforcing and aversive and how hard animals are willing to work to obtain them, there is an objective way to know what they value. Rewards and punishments are at the heart of both human and animal emotion. Emotions are defined as states elicited by the presentation, termination, or omission of rewards and punishes. A positive emotion of pleasure might be elicited by receiving a reward, such as food or warmth in reptiles, whilst negative emotions such as fear might be elicited by an impending punishment, such as forced handling. This way of classifying emotions, whether they are positive or negative, is readily applicable to animal welfare science, since good welfare can be seen as animals having predominantly positive emotions. This means that we should not be assessing welfare just by whether animals are showing natural behaviour, but whether they are doing what they value, as seen by what they are willing to work for. Not all natural behaviours turn out to have the same value to an animal. To show an animal value something means showing that it will work for reward. It will learn to perform some arbitrary action to obtain it. For example, hens in studies will peck a key to gain access to straw. Pigs, cows and sheep will learn to operate switches for the reward of heat. King snakes will learn to turn a key for access to water. Burmese pythons will learn to press an illuminated button to gain access to food. There are many different ways to measure motivation. These include spatial distribution. The ways that animals position themselves within their environments can be particularly useful for identifying what an animal wants when formal tests are simply not feasible. For example, this royal python was seen repeatedly hanging off the wires in its environment. Its spatial distribution would suggest the animal requires more opportunity to climb, or at least achieve height. This can be sensitive and reveal subtleties in what more formal methods can miss. Time spent. Looking at spatial distribution over time gives an even clearer idea of what animals want, particularly if they move around and so make repeated choices about where they want to be. Measuring the amount of time animals spend on or near resources such as perches, hides, or basking areas is an easy, non-disruptive way of seeing which ones they value by where they spend most of their time. It can also help out rule out ones they do not value. Something cannot be classed as enrichment if the animal takes no notice or avoids it altogether. It can be hardly claimed they value it. Approach/avoidance. Another more structured way of assessing what an animal values is to measure the speed of their approaching or moving away from something. Crawford and Holmes, 1966, applied vibrational stimulation to 8 eastern rat snakes in a 2-compartment chamber. Vibrations were applied to one chamber. The snakes could then move to the other chamber to escape the stimulus. With repetitions, they recorded a notable reduction in mean response times. The snakes successfully learned which location they could choose to escape stimulation. This shows that this species finds vibrations aversive and shows clear avoidance behaviour, showing that vivariums should not be placed near sources of vibrations such as television sets. Choice tests can be conducted on a small scale, such as offering an animal a choice of 2 or more types of food, flooring, or types of bedding material. It can be impossible at times to use any of the previously mentioned methods to discover what an animal does or does not value, because all methods require an animal to have multiple experiences so that it can give an opinion on what is happening to it. Where something happens only once, such as being caught or having a one-off medical procedure, it's not possible to see whether the experience results in a change of behaviour, however negative or positive the experience might have been, because there is no next time. Conditioned place preference or avoidance can be very useful methods, as they involve training animals to associate one place with a particular experience such as food or a loud noise, and a second place with something completely different, usually where nothing happens. The animal's preference for being in one place or another is measured both before and after the experience has been investigated. If, after a single experience, there is a shift in where the animal chooses to spend its time there, so that it starts to spend more time where it obtained a reward, then it suggests that it liked the experience and is trying to repeat it. Conversely, if it now avoids the place where the stimulus appeared, and it starts to prefer the place where it did not experience it, then this suggests that it found this stimulus aversive and wants to get away from it. The advantage of this method is that it can work with just one experience, provided the animal makes the association. Demonstrating what they find rewarding or punishing using operant conditioning is still the best test of what they value having or being able to avoid. The easiest way to distinguish a mechanism based on rewards and punishments from simpler mechanisms is to make the reward contingent on the animal making a completely arbitrary response, such as pressing down on a lever or turning around in a circle, and then seeing whether the animal will learn to do the exact opposite and push the lever upwards or circle in the other direction when the reward contingencies change. If the animal can continuously update its behaviour and do whatever it takes to get that reward, then clearly there is no fixed relationship between the stimulus and the response, and we have correctly identified that it's the animal's goal is obtaining the reward. Even if an animal will work for a reward, this does not completely complete the link to welfare. To do this, we need to know whether obtaining what is being approached, preferred, or worked for is actually what matters to the animal. In other words, we need to know not just what an animal wants, but how much it wants it in comparison to something we know is already important to it, most obviously food. One way of doing this is to make it more difficult for an animal to access a reward, and then see if it wants that reward so much that it will overcome the difficulties and effectively pay a higher price for every reward. If it's prepared to pay an even higher price, and particularly if it's prepared to pay the same price as it would for food, then we have an objective measure of what it values. The way a price is paid can vary to suit the animal and the circumstances. To demonstrate what they value, animals have been willing to demonstrate in other studies that they're willing to squeeze through a narrow gap, walk down a long corridor, push a weighted door, walk through a water bath, run over an electric grid, be blasted with jet air, or simply repeatedly perform an operant response such as picking a key not once, but many times for a reward. The maximum price an animal is prepared to pay in the face of these increasing difficulties before it gives up and refuses to pay the price can then be used as a measure of how much it values that reward. If the animal will pay as much for access to bedding material as it will pay for food, it is showing, at least in that moment, that it values bedding as much as food. Natural behaviour is behaviour shown by wild or free-ranging members of a species that evolved as adaptations to the ancestral environment. Tinbergen argued that questions about adaptation could only be sensibly argued by studying animals in the natural habitat, where doing or not doing the behaviour could be demonstrated to make a difference in life or death. It might therefore seem irrelevant to ask the question about captive animals that are now in environments that are different from those in which their ancestors evolved and are largely protected from the hazards their wild ancestors faced. They have been selectively bred by humans so that many look and behave differently from wild animals. It's important to understand why understanding the adaptive significance of behaviour in wild species is important to welfare. It can help us understand why their descendants, living in a completely different man-made environment, can sometimes behave in ways that are harmful to themselves. Some people see the fact that animals do not always choose what is good for their health in the long run is a serious objection to using what animals value as a welfare metric. Animals such as king snakes may eat too much and become life-threateningly obese. This is because they're still valuing the rewards their ancestors did, but in their current captive environments, these rewards no longer align with what's best for health. Wild snakes often have to opportunistically eat when food is available, so overeat not knowing when the next meal is coming. The lesson here is to use what animals value in the here and now as an important part of their welfare, but to realise that it's not the only measure of welfare that is important. It must be considered alongside physical health, as animals, like humans, do not always choose what's best for them in the long run. Animal welfare involves a balance between what is best for the long-term health and what is valued in the moment, just as it does with us humans. Tinbergen's final question about the phylogeny of behaviour is the least researched question in the context of natural behaviour and welfare, but it deserves more attention than it gets. Tinbergen himself was concerned with how behaviour changes over time, at the species level, in a descendant, and how it may be an exaggerated version of its ancestral species. Many of our domestic species are still the same species as their wild ancestor, but there have been major changes in their body shape, behaviour and other traits, as shown by many different breeds that have been produced by artificial selection. So let's bring this back to herpetoculture then. So you may think of that as only being related to things we have truly domesticated, but we're artificially selecting for things in captivity, we just don't realise it. For example, some species of king snakes eat reptilian prey, such as lizards, and have a preference for lizards. Through captive breeding of these species, hatchlings that hatched out and wouldn't take rodent prey and subsequently died were selected against, which means that the genes that were able to be proliferated were animals that were willing to eat mammalian prey. So we've artificially selected for individuals that will eat rodents rather than lizards. Again, another example might be you've got this snake that's really snappy, that's really defensive, that wants a lot of distance between you and it and its flight distance before it feels non-stressed. And it bites a lot. And you as the keeper are not really fond of that snake. So subconsciously it's not your favourite. But you've got another snake that's really docile and really lovely, and you love that snake. So that's your main breeder. But what you're doing subconsciously is selecting against this snappy behaviour and this defensiveness, and you're breeding for docility. You just don't realise you're doing it. So subconsciously we're breeding for traits that we find desirable, and we're artificially selecting for and shifting things further away from what may be present and exhibited in the wild counterparts. One of the most important things we humans do is select for single traits, and we find this leads to unforeseen problems. For example, selection for young adult high growth rate in broiler chickens has led to skeletal and other problems, including obesity in the adult birds. And these birds are now used for breeding, so they have to be feed restricted, which in itself is another welfare issue. Or how about how many neurological wobbles in multiple genes in ball pythons? Obviously most notably in spiders, but it's in a lot of genes as well. Or behavioural traits associated with different genes. Like champagne royal pythons are known for being more tweaky, more reactive, more snappy than others of different morphs. Natural selection, on the other hand, is multi-trait. Every change, such as an increase in growth rate, has a result in a net positive overall improvement in survival and reproduction, so that a bird that grew faster but could not walk or reproduce would be selected against. In nature, only faster growing individuals that could walk and produce offspring would contribute genetically to the next generation, whereas in domestic environments, individuals that would not survive in the wild can not only be kept alive, but be bred from. Humans have selectively bred animals with traits that humans favour, such as fast growth rate, milk yield, or docility in snakes, usually with little heed or knowledge or other traits that have been selected for either as a byproduct or as the underlying mechanism. For example, selecting chickens and pigs for fast growth rate has involved changes to their anatomy and their metabolism, affecting how much they eat, how hungry they become, and how well they can deal with heat stress, and many other aspects of their bodies and behaviour that we're only just beginning to understand. Artificial selection has affected gene expression, brain structure, hormonal balance, and countless other traits. Understanding what we have done, the phylogeny of domestication, is an important contribution to animal welfare. And I put it to you that the same is happening in herpetoculture. How many single traits are we breeding for, but we don't understand what's going along with it? I put it to you that we simply don't know what we're doing yet. Natural behaviour, in terms of what their wild counterparts would do in the wild, can be a really good indication, and it's probable So that's probably what captive snakes value too, but it's not an absolute. It only merely allows us to produce a hypothesis. So for example, there's papers on eastern black king snakes and showing that they have preferred den sites around a habitat and they prefer deep leaf litter. Now I can make the logical assumption that okay, I should give my eastern black king snakes deep leaf litter, but I've jumped there and assumed that that's the case. The hypothesis is that they are likely to value leaf litter because their wild counterpart does also. So therefore we can test this by testing how much they're willing to work for that leaf litter. And by comparing that to other things such as food, we can see how much they value that. So there's a framework building now, a framework on how we can really figure out what these animals want and really get up to this upper notch of animal welfare. So there's a framework on using natural behaviour and building hypotheses, but there's also a framework for folklore husbandry and using that as building hypotheses as well. So then, what if there is a larger philosophy and this big rigid framework that gives us a really good way of approaching herpetoculture? And that, my friends, is the subject of another video essay.